was late, probably close to midnight, when I finally got back on the road. I'd just left my best friend's house after a long dinner, and the hour-long drive home felt heavier than usual. The highway stretched out ahead of me, dark and nearly empty, except for the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the blackness. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. The drive should have been uneventful, but something about that night felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the moonlight cast shadows on the road or the oppressive silence inside the car. You know that feeling? Like the air itself is charged with something you can't quite put your finger on. That's how it felt. That's when the lights started flashing. Red and blue. My stomach dropped. I wasn't speeding, I was sure of it. But what else could it be? Maybe a broken taillight? I wasn't about to risk it. The road was deserted, so I pulled over, flipping on my hazards. But something didn't sit right. The car wasn't a patrol car. It was an old black sedan, the kind you'd never associate with law enforcement. And when the driver stepped out, my unease turned into outright dread. He wasn't wearing a uniform, no badge on his chest, no utility belt, just jeans, a worn leather jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He walked with this deliberate, almost casual stride, like he wasn't in a hurry at all. In his hand, he held up a badge, flashing it quickly before tucking it away. "License and registration," he said, his voice gruff and unkind. I hesitated, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Routine stop," he said flatly. "License and registration." Against my better judgment, I handed them over, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. He didn't look at the papers right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, staring at me through the window. It wasn't the kind of look you'd expect from a cop. It was, predatory. He finally walked back to his car, and that's when I noticed something else. His car didn't have any of the markings you'd expect, not even a light bar on top. The flashing lights were coming from a small device stuck on the dashboard. My chest tightened. This wasn't right. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat and texted my brother. "Pulled over by an unmarked car. Doesn't feel legit. Stay on alert." My hands were shaking as I hit send, glancing up to check the rearview mirror. The man was still standing by his car, but he wasn't looking at my license or registration. He was just standing there, staring at my car. My phone buzzed. A reply from my brother. "Call the cops if you're unsure." That's when the man started walking back toward my car. He didn't have my papers in his hand. He leaned down to my window, and this time, he was closer. "Step out of the car," he said. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Step out of the car," he repeated, more forcefully this time. His tone sent chills down my spine. He didn't sound like a cop. He sounded like someone pretending to be one. I didn't even think. My instincts took over. "I'm not getting out," I said, locking the doors. His jaw tightened, and he slammed his hand against the window, hard enough to rattle the glass. That's when I threw the car into drive and floored it. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped off, leaving him standing in the middle of the road. But my relief was short-lived. Seconds later, his headlights appeared in my mirror, and the red and blue lights began flashing again. He was chasing me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The road twisted and turned, but he stayed on my tail, his car getting closer with every second. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a turnoff up ahead, a narrow dirt road leading into the woods. Without thinking, I veered onto it, my car bouncing over the uneven terrain. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at the sides of the car. I killed the headlights, plunging myself into darkness, and prayed he wouldn't follow. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The only sound was the ticking of my car's engine cooling down. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. Then I saw his headlights. He'd followed me. Panic set in. I knew I couldn't outrun him on this road. My only chance was to get back to the highway. I threw the car into reverse, slamming the gas and spinning the wheel to turn myself around. His car was close now, his headlights nearly blinding me. I sped back onto the main road, scanning desperately for any sign of help. And then I saw it. A gas station, its lights glowing faintly in the distance. 2 trucks were parked outside, their drivers standing by the pumps. A lifeline. I swerved into the lot, slamming on the brakes and jumping out of the car. "Help!" I screamed, running toward the station. Behind me, the black sedan screeched to a halt at the edge of the lot. For a moment, I thought he might get out, but then he backed up, the car disappearing into the night. The gas station clerk called the police, and I waited inside, shaking uncontrollably. When the officers arrived, I told them everything, but there wasn't much they could do. The man had no plates on his car, no identifying marks, nothing to track him by. "You did the right thing by leaving," one of the officers said. "That wasn't a cop. We don't use unmarked cars for night stops, and no officer would ask you to step out alone like that." For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. Every time I drove at night, I found myself checking the mirrors, scanning for those headlights. Who was he? What did he want? I'll never know. But I do know one thing. If I hadn't trusted my instincts, I might not be here to tell this story. I was in between jobs when the opportunity came up. My mom's friend Linda was going out of town for a week and needed someone to house sit. It seemed easy enough. Water the plants, collect the mail, and make sure the place didn't burn down. Linda offered to pay me $500 for the week, and considering my bank account was running on fumes, I didn't hesitate to accept. The house was a gorgeous 2-story colonial on Ridgeway Lane, tucked away in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. Linda was a widow, and her kids were grown, so the place was empty most of the time. She showed me around the day before she left, going over all the little details, how to work the alarm system, where the spare key was hidden, and which plants needed more attention than others. "You'll love it here," she said with a warm smile. "It's so peaceful." She didn't mention how unsettling the house felt at night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, like the faint creak of footsteps on hardwood. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The house was old, and old houses make noises, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I fell back asleep, but not before locking the guest room door. The next day passed without incident. I spent most of it lounging around, scrolling through my phone, and occasionally checking on the plants. By evening, I started to feel more at ease, almost embarrassed by how jumpy I'd been the night before. That changed when I went to take out the trash. The backyard was bordered by a thick row of trees that Linda said were great for privacy. As I dragged the trash bag to the bins near the fence, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I glanced toward the trees but saw nothing, just shadows. I was about to head back inside when something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in one of the upstairs windows. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. It was quick, just a dark shape passing behind the curtains. Did I leave the curtains open? I muttered to myself. My mind raced, trying to remember. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light. But my legs were already moving, carrying me back inside. I locked every door and window in the house, double-checking the alarm system. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. Something about being on the ground floor made me feel safer. I left a lamp on and curled up with a blanket, determined to make it through the night without freaking myself out. At around 1 a.m., I heard it again, those faint footsteps. This time they were louder, more deliberate. My skin prickled as the sound moved from the hallway to the stairs, each creak sending a fresh wave of panic through me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a heavy candlestick from the coffee table, and moved toward the sound. The footsteps had stopped, but my ears were straining for any hint of movement. That's when I noticed something strange. The basement door was open. Linda had explicitly told me that the basement was off limits. "There's nothing down there but old junk," she had said. But now the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. I stared at the open door, my heart pounding. Every instinct told me to shut it and lock it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The air in the basement was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stacks of old boxes and furniture draped in dusty sheets. I moved cautiously, my every step echoing on the concrete floor. About halfway down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading deeper into the basement. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. I followed the footprints, my flashlight shaking in my hand. They led to a far corner of the basement, where an old wardrobe stood against the wall. The wardrobe was slightly open, the darkness inside seeming to pulse with a life of its own. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. Just as I was about to pull it open, I heard a voice, a soft, guttural whisper coming from inside the wardrobe. "I see you." I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. My legs felt like jelly, but adrenaline took over, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it, shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch, clutching the candlestick and staring at the basement door. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, my mind racing with what could be lurking below. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I called Linda and told her I couldn't house sit anymore. I didn't go into detail, just said there was an emergency. She sounded disappointed but understanding. I left the house that morning, my nerves still frayed. Linda returned a few days later and called me, saying everything seemed fine. She asked why I had left so suddenly, and I hesitated before telling her about the basement. Her response sent chills down my spine. "The basement door," she said. "That's strange. I always keep it locked. It doesn't even have a key." I haven't spoken to Linda since, but sometimes late at night, I think about that whisper. I don't know what was in the wardrobe, and I pray I never find out. Last summer, my best friend Brian invited me on a weekend trip to his uncle's cabin, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a guy's getaway, just me, Brian, and a few of his college friends, Nate, Eric, and Rob. I didn't know them well, but I figured it would be fun to unwind and disconnect for a bit. The cabin was miles from civilization. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just dense woods, and the kind of isolation that felt equal parts relaxing and unsettling. As we unloaded the car and carried our stuff inside, I couldn't help but notice how old the cabin was. It wasn't rustic in a charming way. It felt wrong somehow. The wood was warped, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. Inside, it was just as eerie. The furniture was outdated. The walls were lined with dusty framed photos of people who looked like they belonged in the 1800s, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood. "Don't mind the vibe," Brian joked, slapping me on the back. "My uncle's a bit of a hermit, but it's cool. We'll have fun." I smiled, but I already felt on edge. That first afternoon, Brian suggested we check out a trail behind the cabin. The woods were dense, the air heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. As we walked, Brian pointed out landmarks, like an old well covered with moss and an abandoned rusted pickup truck half buried in the underbrush. "What's with all the creepy stuff?" Nate joked, kicking a rock toward the truck. Brian shrugged. "The area's got history. My uncle says people used to live back here before the town moved further down the mountain." That answer didn't exactly make me feel better. As we ventured deeper, the trail grew narrower. Eventually, we reached a small clearing. At the center stood a circle of stones, each one about knee-high and covered in strange carvings. "What is this?" Eric asked, crouching to inspect the stones. "Probably some old ritual site," Brian said casually. "My uncle told me about it once. People in the area used to hold ceremonies here a long time ago." "Ceremonies?" I asked. "Like what?" Brian hesitated. "I don't know." He didn't go into detail, but he said to stay away from it. That was enough for me. I didn't want to be anywhere near those stones. I convinced the group to head back to the cabin, but the image of the carved stones stuck with me. That night, we lit a fire in the pit outside the cabin and settled in with some beers. The atmosphere was lighter than earlier, and for a while I actually felt relaxed. But then, as the conversation died down, I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the woods. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking toward the trees. The others shrugged it off, but the tapping continued. It was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on wood with a stick. It seemed to move, circling the cabin. "Probably just animals," Rob said, though his voice wavered. But it didn't sound like animals. It sounded human. The tapping stopped after a while, but the unease lingered. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, we found something disturbing. Just outside the cabin, on the dirt path leading to the trail, someone, or something, had drawn symbols in the dirt. They looked similar to the carvings on the stones we'd seen the day before. Swirling patterns and jagged shapes that didn't make sense. Brian's face went pale when he saw them. "What's wrong?" I asked. He hesitated. "My uncle told me about these. They're warnings. He said if you see them, it means you're being watched." "Watched by who?" Nate asked, trying to laugh it off. Brian didn't answer. We spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the weirdness, but it was hard. The woods felt different now. Heavier, quieter. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area. That night, as we sat around the fire again, the tapping returned. This time it was louder and closer. Everyone fell silent, staring into the woods. "Should we check it out?" Eric asked, gripping his beer can tightly. Before anyone could answer, the firelight illuminated something just beyond the tree line. It was faint at first, but as we squinted, we could make out several figures standing in the shadows. They weren't moving, just watching. "Get inside," Brian whispered. We didn't argue. We scrambled into the cabin, locking the door behind us. The fire outside sputtered and died, plunging the clearing into darkness. From the window, I could see the figures moving closer. They wore cloaks and animal masks, deer, wolves, owls, and they carried torches that flickered in the night. "Is this some kind of prank?" Nate asked, his voice shaking. "No," Brian said. "They're not people." We huddled in the living room, peeking out the windows as the figures circled the cabin. One of them began to chant in a low, guttural voice, and the others joined in. The sound was rhythmic and hypnotic, like a song from a nightmare. "What do they want?" I asked. Brian didn't answer. He was staring at the back door, which had started to rattle. "They're trying to get in," he said. Suddenly the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, from the front yard, a single torch was thrown onto the porch. Flames erupted, licking at the cabin's walls. "We have to get out of here," Eric yelled. We grabbed whatever we could and bolted out the back door, running blindly into the woods. The figures didn't chase us, at least not that we could see, but their chanting resumed, echoing through the trees. We ran for what felt like hours, eventually stumbling onto a dirt road. A passing car stopped to help us, and we piled in, begging the driver to take us anywhere but there. The next day, Brian called his uncle to tell him what happened. His uncle was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "I told you to stay away from the stones." We never went back to that cabin. To this day, I still have nightmares about the figures in the woods. I don't know who or what they were, but I'm certain they weren't human.